Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Sage Advice. I am Greg Tito, and I am joined by Mr. Jeremy Crawford.
Hello, everyone.
How is it going?
Great.
Great.
Yes. It's the new year. We get to work on D&D. What's not to like?
Exactly. Well, except for all the other things that are happening in the world. But we'll ignore that for this next hour while we talk about some fun stuff in Dungeons & Dragons rules that we don't necessarily get from, your Sage Advice columns or things like that. This is a way for us to kind of investigate different bigger topics in what is going on with the mechanics and the intent of the design behind them. And today we are going to talk about encounter building.
Yes, indeed.
I immediately latched onto when you said challenge rating, and you're like, no, it's bigger than challenge rating. It's like the whole idea, but that'll be a part of the discussion too, is what CR means for us and how to interpret that and use that when you're building encounters.
Exactly.
Right. So where do you want to start? Should we start with the first encounter?
The first encounter.
Of the third kind?
Well, the spaceship descends from the sky.
There's mashed potatoes.
That point you to where you can meet the Spelljammer that will take you up into the Phlogiston and travel from Faerun to Orth. But wait, that's not what we're talking about today.
God, we should. Now you got like 50 people who are like, we should talk about that right now.
One of these days, I will happily do a Spelljammer one.
Yeah, nice. They've talked about it a lot on Lori Should Know. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, plus my home campaign is chock full of airships and Spelljammer type craft, so it's near and dear to my heart.
Nice.
But encounters.
Yes. How you encounter them?
Which can certainly include airships and creatures from beyond the stars.
I like that you're justifying the tangent.
Yes.
You're like it's okay. It's the same.
I mean, this is sort of the beauty in D&D that in some ways D&D is all tangent since you can encounter pretty much anything. And the encounter rules in 5th edition, which are expressed in their most detailed fashion in the Dungeon Master's Guide, are really there to help DMs get a handle on how difficult a combat encounter in particular might be. Mm-hmm. Now, we know that in a game that has 3 main pillars, combat, social interaction, and exploration, in the just sort of normal English sense of the word encounter, you can have other kinds of encounters. I mean, you can have a heated argument with somebody, a diplomatic engagement of some kind. You can encounter something wondrous in the wilderness, but it not involve battle in any way. When we talk about encounter building, we're specifically zeroing in on combat encounters. And the whole reason we have these rules is not because there's assumed to be a correct way of building encounters. That's actually one of the main things I wanted to get across in this segment is there is not one right way to do it.
There's not like some mystical formula. If you just add this and add this, you'll get the most fun that your players will ever have.
Exactly. Because we have all had experiences in D&D games where the drunk goblin at the gate all by itself could end up being more fun than the carefully calibrated set-piece battle, at the top of a tower while there's a vortex to hell nearby. It's like the drunk goblin, if role-played well, can be just as exciting, even if the numbers tell you this is not really a challenge. Right. So much in D&D is about the story that's brought to bear, the role-playing, not only by the DM, but also by the players. But you do often as a DM, particularly when you're writing an adventure, preparing for a session, have this question that will pop into your head. And this is really the question that the encounter building rules are meant to answer. And that is this going to kill them all?
Am I throwing too much at them and the kitchen sink?
Yes. And so the encounter building rules are really there for the DM to try to suss out in advance, is this encounter going to be too dangerous? Now, you can also use the encounter building rules to assess, is it going to be super easy? Is it going to be just right? Is it going to be kind of hard? Or is it going to be super duper hard and probably kill them all? The rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide help you get a sense of where in the spectrum of difficulty an encounter is likely to land.
Yeah.
It really, in the end, though, is really just giving you a sense. And the reason why I say this is there are so many variables that can come into play in a D&D encounter. You could have an encounter where you face 4 ogres, and you're standing on a road on, a wheat-filled plain. That encounter is going to play out very differently if you met the same 4 ogres on a collapsing bridge over a chasm of lava.
Right.
With occasional, lava jets shooting up at you while you're trying to fight the ogres and not fall off the bridge to almost certain death below. So just environmental factors can change how difficult something will be in play. We also know that because of the variability that we've built into the game with things like critical hits and the recharge abilities of certain monsters, that an encounter that you could DM it with one group, and because of how the dice rolled for you, it was not too bad.
Yeah.
The very next group, if you as DM, your dice are on fire, suddenly that very same combat encounter could be devastating.
Right.
A great example of this is our dragons have breath weapons that use the recharge mechanic, and many of them will come back on a roll of a 5 or a 6, in some cases just a 6 on a d6.
Mm-hmm.
And you could have a group where they just have rotten luck, and that breath weapon keeps coming back. And in that case, that dragon's going to be way more difficult than it would be normally.
Or the opposite can happen where, whether not even just by chance, but like a good circumstance or taking advantage of the circumstances on the part of the player can, ruin a carefully crafted, tentpole encounter where you're like, okay, this is going to be the big bad. And someone rolls a crit, someone has a really great idea on how to sneak into something, and then all of a sudden, all that dramatic combat that you planned for the next 3 hours gets diffused in 30 minutes.
Exactly. And the thing is, that variability, we consider it to be a feature, not a bug of the game.
I'm not sure if everyone out there thinks that way, but yeah.
But we designed this variability into the game partly for the sake of narrative surprise, not only for the players, but for the dungeon master.
Oh, that's a good point.
We love that not even the DM can fully predict how something is going to play out. And that makes it so that even the DM gets to experience D&D as a game.
Yeah.
Without some of these little dice surprises that occur in pretty much every session of D&D, it would be super easy for DMs to predict and railroad various outcomes. Because of that variability, even that question of, will the dragon be able to use its breath weapon a second time, lets the DM in on that fun, the fun of just you're playing a game and you don't even know. You're the narrator of the story, and you don't even know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I think that point is lost for some players who don't realize that they want their dungeon master to be these puppet masters and having all the answers, and they portray themselves that way. I mean, I know as a dungeon master, sometimes I will make it seem like, I knew exactly what was going to happen when I had no clue. But you're right, there is that nugget of fun for the dungeon master to roll with the improv just as much as of a dice roll and how it goes, just as much as the players like to do that.
And I, as a DM, love to really let myself have fun with that game aspect. So one example of me doing this is anytime I'm running a monster with a recharge ability, I will almost always roll the recharge die on the other side of the DM screen so the players can see it. Right. So that they're seeing that I don't even know.
It's not me, guys.
And
it's a chance.
Even better, a lot of the time I have the players roll it.
Ooh.
Because then it really changes the dynamic of basically it gives them sometimes this terrible feeling of we caused its breath weapon to recharge.
Right, that's kind of cruel. Way to go, Jerry. You're like, if you had just rolled better,
you
that
wouldn't all be dead.
Number generator, you would have done better. Yeah.
Yeah. But it creates those improv opportunities, which I think often lead to our favorite moments when playing D&D. Sometimes it can lead to spectacular, unexpected success. And then it can also lead to catastrophe.
Right.
Sometimes the catastrophe in my mind is even better than the spectacular success because I think something I like to talk about, and I know many other experienced DMs like to talk about, is this notion of leaning into failure, of seeing failure in a narrative game like D&D as an opportunity to steer things in new and wonderful directions, to have one problem spawn other problems for the heroes to try to solve, or villains if you're playing a group of rascals, because some D&D parties are a bunch of rascals.
Because there can be definitely moments when you're playing where you roll a hit and you miss, and I'm guilty of this sometimes myself. I'm like, oh, okay, I just missed. Go to the next turn, blah blah blah. But I love the moments when you describe exactly how you missed. And you're right, that can often lead to just more storytelling, right? If you just are like, okay, I rolled this dice and I didn't get the number I hit, there's not a lot of narrative play there, right? But if you say like, oh, I swung my sword and I hit a barrel of oil and that oil is leaking all over the floor, you're like, all right, well, that's more possibilities. Maybe someone takes advantage of it. Maybe you take advantage of that, and so all of a sudden a failure becomes something that makes the dynamic of the encounter so much more interesting.
Yeah, and now when that oil is oozing around the battlefield, people are like, "Oh my God, don't cast burning hands!"
Yeah, right. Or go, engineer it in a way to get them in the enemies in the right situation to cast that. Yeah, exactly. Which is way more fun than I missed. Go to the next person.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So the CR, or the challenge rating, is meant to be a tool to, even though there is all this variance in how an encounter will play out in real play, to at least give you this is, in an ideal situation, this is how difficult this encounter is going to be for my players.
Yes. So the challenge rating in our monsters, it basically, what it communicates to you on its own is that a monster of a particular challenge rating on its own will usually, it's not going to wipe a group out if you have a group of sort of a regular size, which can run anywhere between like 3 and 6 characters. And I give a range there, because even though often in our rules they'll say the typical group is 4, or it's fine if it's 5, and 6 is okay too, and maybe 3. That number shifts depending on the mix of the group. So let's say you have a group, no one has a single healing ability. Everyone has, sort of their hit points are in the basement. They all, con was their dump stat, and they rolled for their hit points and rolled horribly.
A suboptimal party? Is
yes,
that what you're trying to say?
Yes. If you have a suboptimal party, there could even be 5 of you, and suddenly, what is actually not too hard for the 3 or 4 person group is a nightmare for you because of your mix.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a range there. But again, if let's say typical group, usually 4 to 5 characters, you look at the CR, or even 6 characters, you look at the CR and you think, oh yeah, this CR3 monster is not going to give a third level party too much trouble. And that's really all it's telling you. It's not telling you this is going to make a satisfying fight. It's not telling you everyone's going to have a lot of fun if you do this. Because there's so much more art involved in, again, the role playing and the environment you use. Really, again, all it's telling you is how likely is this thing to just kill them all, and do so easily. Now it starts getting trickier when you start adding monsters together, because it's fairly rare for a combat encounter to just be one monster, unless it's a legendary monster. And a legendary monster is really designed to be sort of an entire encounter in itself. This is why legendary creatures have their legendary actions, which they get to take at the end of other people's turns.
Right.
I mean, they're
almost acting like a group of monsters in that situation, right?
Exactly. And we've designed them as such that it's like this monster shows up and it's basically, I'm a whole group of people.
And I've got all these actions that I can always do every turn, right?
Yeah.
But going back to what you were saying about the 3, a challenge rating of 3, if you're a third level party, it shouldn't be too hard. But when you add in another third level or 3 CR monster, how does that change it?
So it's at that point that you're going to want to take a look at the rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, where it basically takes the monsters, turns them into hit point totals, and says, okay, total up these hit points. I'm sorry, not hit points, experience points, and then compare that to the levels of the characters in the party. There are tables for you to look at, and it helps you gauge how difficult a group of monsters is likely to be for a party of a particular level. Mm-hmm. Now, in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, we provide an alternative way of assessing this. And frankly, I think it's an easier way because the approach in the Dungeon Master's Guide requires you to do quite a bit of math. And because not only are you basically reducing all the monsters to piles of XP, and then you compare those to levels, it then also introduces this notion of once a party gets big enough that you then also have to apply a multiplier to deal with the fact that the more player characters you have, the less difficult a certain group of monsters become. Yeah. It also has the opposite of that, of the smaller your group gets, then there's another multiplier, which also changes the difficulty. I, as a DM, created a spreadsheet that does all of this for me, but we realized not everyone is going to want to have to do all of these calculations. So in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, we have a new set of tables where you can cross-reference, look up CR, look up the level of the characters, and then it just tells you, this number of creatures of this CR is not going to be too hard for this number of characters of this level. So it does a lot of the math for you. And then there's also a separate table specifically for monsters you're likely to meet by themselves. So usually that's going to mean a legendary monster. But again, it's important, especially for people who are coming from 3rd and 4th edition, to not mistake what these encounter building guidelines are telling them. We're not telling you, a correct encounter has this mix of monsters. A correct encounter is one that people have a good time playing through. Right. That is actually the only measure of did you build a good encounter was did people have a good time? If the answer is yes, you built a great encounter. Right. All these rules are telling you is it's giving you an assessment in advance of how likely a particular monster or group of monsters is going to give your group a bunch of trouble. Right. When we design our adventures, like Tomb of Annihilation, we use these guidelines not to build our different encounters in the adventure in a kind of highly scientific way. We use them to do exactly this test, and that is this particular potential combat encounter going to be harder than we want it to be? Because for a lot of our published adventures, we'll have broad difficulty targets for different parts of the adventure. For example, we might decide that one chapter of one of our adventures, whether it's Tomb of Annihilation or Storm King's Thunder or Curse of Strahd, is really designed to be not too much trouble for a group that say, like, okay, this chapter might be for generally 6th level characters. Characters of any level can go into that chapter. Yeah. But really what we're doing is just we want to ensure that if the kind of optimal group is there, it's not too much trouble. And then, of course, if you're lower level or less optimal, the difficulty is going to start going up. And then if you're higher level or more optimal, the difficulty is going to start going down. Yeah. So it's really for us, again, just a test for, we just want to make sure that this thing that's meant to be a challenge but not a TPK is indeed a challenge and not a total party kill.
Yeah, and that's a difficult thing to encapsulate in just like, okay, this is the exact number that you need to be in order to get that. I know some dungeon masters I've seen online are like, oh, my characters, my party was at X level, but they really want to go to this place, and how do I tell them not to do that? Because they won't be okay. And I think there is the almost expectation that the dungeon master won't present challenges or encounters that are too far outside their level. Right. And the expectation is like, oh, my dungeon master is not going to try to kill me all the time. But there is something to be said about like, well, that's just, you need to be able to know that there's lethal parts of the world that you cannot always do, or if you do, you have to make sure you're very careful and you're using all of them. You can't just go walk in willy-nilly. And I think there's something in the open, I guess we're talking a little bit more about like, open style adventure writing of you're exploring a whole area versus the more narrative of like, okay, event. But those kind of play into it. It's like, that's why it's harder for some dungeon masters to run sandbox campaigns, is because, well, how do I deal with that?
So a DM could certainly whether it's an adventure they're designing themselves or if they're taking one of our published adventures and modifying it, they could certainly use the encounter building guidelines in the Dungeon Master's Guide or in Xanathar's Guide to adjust all the encounters so that they are designed specifically for their group of characters.
Right.
And these guidelines would help the DM figure out roughly how difficult a combat encounter is going to be. Our starting assumption in 5th edition, though, is that the game is pretty open-ended and sandboxy, and we often like, particularly in our published adventures, dangling out the possibility that you might wander into a fight you can't win.
Yeah.
Because we don't view the game as a series of combat encounters that you are expected to face in a predictable way and then march off with a set amount of experience points and treasure.
Yeah.
We view the game as a set of potential combat encounters, some of which you might not turn into combat at all because you might talk your way out of the problem. You might cleverly use a spell or the environment or one of your class features or an element of your character's background to circumvent the problem entirely. And all of those, to me, are legitimate ways to handle the many challenges that face adventurers in D&D. And often those non-combat ways can be the most exciting when you figure out, okay, we can just avoid this whole thing. And I, as a DM, reward a group that does that sort of problem solving just as much as a group that fights its way through the problems. You know, I'll give just as much experience points, and I'll try to make it so that if there was a treasure involved, that there's an opportunity to gain treasure in some other way at a later point.
Right.
Because the point is moving the story forward, having a great time, and solving problems without, we hope, DMs getting too fixated on only one way through the problem. And that can include not expecting always that people will fight their way through something. I often like, too, having potential combat encounters in an adventure, particularly one that I know I'll be DMing, because then I can control what happens at the table. I often like having ones in the path of the party that the numbers tell me this is way difficult. If they try to fight their way through this without negotiating, without fleeing, this has a good chance of destroying them. Not because I want to destroy them. It's because I love the sense of the world being living and breathing that often gives. That reminds them that they're not in a video game like experience where everything has sort of been pre-calibrated for them. They're in a living world, and they happen to wander into this place that's like, oh boy, and this is too much. And it's often a great opportunity to reveal something about the setting. It's also a chance sometimes to introduce NPCs or friendly monsters that might show up to help them. Sometimes if they do get themselves into trouble, I like to have an ally of theirs show up and help them out, because that's also another sign of it being a living, breathing world, that like, hey, they helped that high-level cleric a while ago, who it turns out has been scrying on them and knew that they were getting into trouble and sends help.
Yeah.
So that also...
It adds to the storytelling. It doesn't take away.
Exactly. I often love to give warnings. So often...
You kind of have to.
Yes. Often quest-giving NPCs in my games will give cues about the danger of something. You know, and we'll do some version of like, are you sure you want to go in there?
Yeah.
You know, and
click yes. No.
Yeah. Like this is what you might be facing, you know, if you go in there. And I've also made use a number of times over the years of DMing of, you know, as a last-ditch effort of a fight starts that I know the players cannot survive, and I will have some version of the NPC who rides by and says some version of "Fly, you fools!" You know,
yeah, right.
Like because again, there are other people in the world, especially if you're not down in a deep dungeon. If you're up in the wilderness, or you're in a city, or in your castle, there's likely someone else in the world knows what you're up against.
Yeah, and knows how dangerous it can be.
And can yell out, are you crazy? Get out of here.
Yeah.
You're going to die.
Or to start off a fight with like a bang, right? Like,
Yeah.
Use the breath weapon in the first round so they know exactly what they're up against or something like that, so that it becomes like, okay, no, this is not just a dragon that is injured and ready to be killed. Like, no, this is a dragon at its height of its power, and you're all going to experience that right now.
Yeah, that happened in my home game more than several sessions ago. The player characters wandered in this mystical place through this portal that allowed them to see a possible future for the campaign and a possible outcome should they fail in their great quest. And so they actually got a glimpse of Doomsday, and they appeared in the midst of this epic battle, and they were on this airship being attacked by an ancient dragon. And I really wanted to drive home for them that, like, this is not a place where you're just going to stand and fight. And so, exactly as you say, the dragon, first thing, breathed, and one of the characters was almost instantly killed. And so my players are experienced. They got the message loud and clear. They're like, we are getting the hell out of here because this is not a fight we can win.
That's cool. That's a good signpost.
Yes.
Use the mirror of Galadriel to show how terrible your life will be if you go down that path.
Yes. So they ran out of that possible future really fast.
Right.
Yes.
But don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So after all we've talked about here, then what are some guidelines that you've used that makes an encounter memorable? I know you said, like, oh, that's the only real measure is, are people talking about it? Did they have fun doing it? Which I totally agree with. But then what are some ways that you can use the stuff that's in our books as well as some of your personal ways to, like, all right, really spice up those encounters?
So one thing that I like to do is ramp encounters up. It's very easy, and this is a fine way to start fights, where you roll initiative. Everyone is there, and like if you're using miniatures, you've placed all the miniatures out on the grid, and fight. I like to vary that sometimes, of having fights where not all the combatants are there at the start. So I like that, the rising tension of the fight getting a little more difficult as it goes along, or less difficult if it turns out the people showing up are actually showing up to help the player characters.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because that's another thing that I really love to play with, is not just your fighting might notify more foes, which happens quite a lot actually in D&D adventures, and in many published adventures even, it will say things like, if you make too much noise, then the monsters in the next door rooms come running in.
Yeah.
Well, particularly because I run a lot of urban games, I run a lot of adventures that take place also in wilderness areas, but then also in dungeons where there are potentially friendly creatures as well. I like sometimes for there to be a chance for helpful people to show up. Or I also like, when it comes to sort of changing circumstances, to have the environment change over the course of a fight. Whether, it's the classic, the place is collapsing, or this portal is opening, or, there's some kind of timed element where there is some MacGuffin in the room where, if it's allowed, if all 3 gems light up over the course of the next few rounds, then something awful TM is going to happen. So I like timed elements. I also, another way I actually introduce this of circumstances changing is, I love having villains who they themselves introduce complications. A great example of this is the villain who loves monologuing so much that they say so. There's the normal way of monologuing where basically, the villain.
I'm going to kill you for all the things that you've done. Let me list all of them right now before I destroy you.
And then sometimes we'll give away part of the plot. So that's the classic villain saying too much. So I do that sometimes, partly just because it's fun. But I also like sometimes adding twists in the midst of combat, where over the course of monologuing, a villain might suddenly plant a seed of doubt in the player characters about why they're fighting this person. Particularly because in my home game, I often have multiple villain groups. Like in my current game, there are at least 4 and if any of my players are listening to this is actually a slight spoiler, because I think they have figured out there are at least 2 villain groups. It actually turns out there are 4 villain groups.
I love that you're saying at least, too, because there could be more. We can add more later.
But the villain groups are actually all at war with each other, and some of them are less evil than others. In fact, one of the villain groups is not actually evil. It just has goals that are different and often opposing to the player characters. So I like to sometimes, if they're up against a foe, have the foe let slip some piece of information that plants a seed of doubt of like, wait a second, this person might not be as bad as we thought.
Right. Is this the right? Should we even be fighting this?
Right.
Yeah.
And then you have those great moments of like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Right. Stop.
Stop. Okay, let's redirect. Because when you realize suddenly the real big bad is someplace else, who might actually be delighting in the fact that these two, that the player characters.
Right. Two of my rivals are taking each other out.
Exactly.
This is exactly what, playing into their plans. Yeah.
I also have a group of villains called the Priests of Osibus, who are actually mentioned in the Curse of Strahd, who my players, oh God, do they hate them. And they're supposed to. I designed them to be hated.
Yeah.
They are a group of necromancers who have this sign burned somewhere on their body called the Mark of Elethon. Their god is Elethon. That when they die, if this mark is not destroyed, after a certain number of rounds, it will illuminate, and they will auto-resurrect as some form of undead. And this just will keep happening until the mark is destroyed. So really, that's just a kind of like fancy special effect for me to add more monsters to an encounter.
Right.
And so I like coming up with fancy ways of basically just some version of more dudes show up.
Yeah.
But there are many ways you can have more guys show up. And again, have this amped up tension so that not every fight is simply here are my pieces on this side, here are your pieces on that side. We roll through a fight and we move on.
Yeah.
That's perfectly acceptable, and it's also good to have those sorts of fights sometimes. Really, where I'm going with all of this is variety is great.
Yeah.
You want a mix of the encounters that are kind of easy and straightforward, ones that are a bit more complex, ones with surprises. If only as a DM to amuse yourself, so you don't get bored. That you're always introducing something that makes your players feel that, oh my gosh, are we going to get through this? Or it's also great to sometimes give them that feeling of, ooh, this is a cakewalk. We've got it.
Yeah, there's that idea that like you can feel powerful if you just throw a bunch of minions. Were great for this in 4th edition for that reason. Where like, oh, you're mowing through these goblins that at first level were a substantial threat to you, but now you're at 6th level, they're nothing, and one fireball takes rid of all of them, and then sometimes that builds that up, and then it's a great way to do that right before the big bad that's going to be the big dragon that's going to blow them out the way, so they feel real powerful, and then oh wait, by the way, let me cut you down the size,
right,
and all that too. So
and I love that you bring that up because great storytelling involves, as we know, showing, not telling. Mm. And I do really like to show in a campaign occasionally that the player characters have gotten more powerful. And as you said, it is great to bring back foes they fought before, types of foes they fought before who gave them trouble and now are easy. It's such a satisfying way for the players to see, oh yeah, we did get more powerful.
I got this.
Yeah. We've got it. Because you want as a DM to give the players victories. So that you can then also give them struggles
and slip that carpet right out from under them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because again, any good story has sort of this rising and falling action, and where the rising tension and then the tension dissipates, and it's a roller coaster.
And there's the idea that we brought it out at the beginning of this conversation, where like if there's a CR guidelines, and those are the ones that you need to follow for every encounter to make sure that they're the exact amount of challenge that will put players up against the wall but won't kill them, right? And if you do that for every single encounter, then that doesn't have any tense moments anymore. You're losing the idea that okay, there's going to be crests and falls and narrative tension will come and go. And there's the danger you can fall into making perfectly crafting encounters too much.
Exactly, because if you do that. If you took our encounter building guidelines and said, all right, I'm going to make my 3rd level group only go up against CR3 monsters, there's a good chance your game is going to start feeling a little monotonous, a little boring. Vary it. Have some encounters that are going to be tougher. Have some encounters that are going to be easier. And the encounter building guidelines in Xanathar's Guide and the DMG are there to help you assess that beforehand. But again, it's not going to be an exact science.
Those are tools that you can use in the craft of encounter building.
Yes, and often you're going to find yourself wanting to adjust difficulty on the fly.
Yeah.
Because, and this is the beauty of having a game that's run by a dungeon master as opposed to, it's not run by the rule book. It's run by the DM, who can see how things are actually going in play.
Yeah. Read the room.
And we've talked about this before, that, read your players, see what's causing them excitement, what's fun for them. You might have calculated things in advance and thought, okay, this encounter is going to be really tough. But then in play, because of the die rolls and the decisions made, it's a cakewalk for the player characters. Sometimes just give them the cakewalk. Let them savor that victory. Other times you can do things to make things a bit more difficult on the spot. One of the easiest things DMs can do, because I get asked a lot, how can, if I see things are going too quickly, and because sometimes that easiness can be narratively unsatisfying. One of the easiest ways that you can add a little difficulty, cause a combat that maybe it feels like the group wants it to go on a little longer, is just raise the hit points of the monsters. In every monster, there's a number of hit points printed, but then next to the hit points, in parentheses, we give the hit dice of the monster. And so if you look in that parentheses, you're basically seeing the potential range of hit points for that creature. It means you could go lower and you could go higher. So play with that range, DMs. Look there, and if you want your standard goblin to be a bit tougher, just look in the parentheses next to its hit points, and you'll see that goblin could indeed go up a bit.
Yeah.
And it could also go down. If you'd like to, let's say you'd like to have monsters that sort of pop like balloons, the way 4th edition style minions do, well then, just bottom out the monster's hit points. Because, again, you have a range there in parentheses.
Yeah.
And you can, because here's the thing, the players are never going to know you're doing it.
Well, hopefully.
Right.
Hopefully you don't have that one player who's like looking over your screen and be like, what?
But I bring this up because it might be easy for a DM to think, well, is that cheating or is that fudging in some way? And no, what I'm telling you is no, that's actually, you're using the monster as intended if you play with that hit point range.
Yeah.
The number that appears as the number of hit points for a monster in the Monster Manual or Volo's Guide to Monsters or in one of our adventures is the average for a monster of that type. It is not like the monster must only have that number of hit points to start. No,
right.
You can vary. And
you can also go the other way, though, too. Like if a fight is taking too long, it feels like they've already kind of bested the strategies needed to make it happen, and you're like 3 rounds left at the current thing to get all the monsters' hit points down. Just lop them off, right?
Exactly.
Because you can go. If that's the average, then you can go at a lesser number, and then everybody's happy. Like, oh yeah, we did it, and you defeated the monster. Good.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Because I'm sure every DM has had that experience where sometimes it's exciting that monster has only 1 hit point left, and everyone's going to enjoy that extra round of combat that's now necessary to shave away that 1 hit point.
Yeah.
But then there are those other times where the person does this awesome blow, they describe it really well, but because of their role, their hit is going to leave the monster with 1 hit point. And many DMs I know have just made that 1 hit point quietly disappear and said the monster dies.
It never existed.
It never existed.
It was a Schrodinger's hit point.
Right. And again, DMs, when you do that, you're not cheating, because our monsters are built for you to have some flexibility.
Yeah.
When it comes to how many hit points they have.
And it all comes down to what you said. Like, what is the guideline for whether an encounter is successful or not? Was it fun?
Was it fun? Now, one thing I also want to talk about before we close is this question of what's the right number of combat encounters in the adventuring day. This is a question I get sometimes. The Dungeon Master's Guide has a section about what's called the adventuring day. And it mentions that a typical party can withstand 6 to 8 encounters before they're going to need a long rest. This bit in the Dungeon Master's Guide sometimes gets misread as saying sort of a correct adventuring day has 6 to 8 encounters. That is not the intent of that text. Really, again, all that text is telling you is if you're curious, DM, about how much can they take in a day, 6 to 8 encounters is the limit. Now, this is assuming that they are encounters of sort of typical difficulty. If they're all cakewalks, well, then, a party might be able to take more.
Yeah.
But a typical group up against, average difficulty combat encounters is going to tucker out around 6 to 8 encounters. Again, we do not design the game thinking the correct adventuring day is 6 to 8 encounters. Because many adventuring days might have only one. Some will have 3. Some will have 4. That's fine. Those are all legitimate ways to construct a D&D adventure.
But the 6 to 8 number, just basically the ones that where resources begin, like spells and consumable things, will start to get low.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then we also tell you that, especially in an adventuring day that runs on that long, then a group is also likely to have 1 or 2 short rests. But that's, again, highly variable, and that's fine. The game is designed to accommodate that variability.
Well, that's why I only schedule 6 to 8 meetings per day, is because that's the limit. I can only have 6 to 8 encounters in my working day.
Right.
And I tell my boss, I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I can't have any more.
It's funny how it does kind of map to the work day. Yeah. I can only take 8 meetings, although, that sounds like a lot.
I didn't even get a short rest today.
I know. Have you been trapped in this room
the whole time? The whole time. This is only my 4th encounter of the day, so I think I'm okay. Yeah. It has been a great time talking to you. Those were great nuggets of sage advice. If people want to get in touch with you and ask you more about encounter building or anything with the D&D 5th edition rules, how can they do so?
Best way is on Twitter, where I can be reached at Jeremy E. Crawford.
Awesome. I am at Greg Tito. You can ask me some of those things, and maybe if Jeremy's busy, I'll walk him over to him and do these things called letters. It's crazy. But thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with another different segment in next week. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
All right, Twitch folks. We got done a couple minutes early, so we might be able to take maybe just one, and then we got to do some tests here. So I think we're going to do one really good question from the chat group. We don't have time to do a whole other segment, obviously.
Right.
We always try to be like, oh, we can do 2 or 3 segments in one thing, but no, we just talk a lot.
Yeah, we are so chatty.
We want to make sure we get to all of the topics of the topic, though, right?
I know, and it's fun to talk about D&D.
It's true, right? Exactly. So one of these days, we're going to do like a whole day of just you and me doing sage advice segments. See, but then that would get boring, too. Like, it's all about the variety.
Yeah.
All right, makes sense. This is an interesting question. I'm not really sure what it means, but it's from Stabby Rogue Games. I found that working as a business analyst has helped me as a DM. Do you use any UML diagrams, like sequence diagrams, in your campaigns? Do you know what a UML diagram is?
Well, if the question's referring to, different ways to do flowcharts and whatnot, or, you can do sort of decision trees, then sometimes, yes, I do that, particularly if I create a very complex plot line. I will sometimes like to visualize it in advance to see how things might flow and to make sure the decision points in the campaign are clear to me. But honestly, in most campaigns, I leave so much up to the decisions the players are going to make that I do a lot of planning and course correction before each session, because I'm a big believer in preparing as little as possible. So
you mean
again,
like before a campaign, right? Because you can't. You get too railroady if you do too much.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. But sometimes, doing some form of flowchart, it's some form of visualization can be a really powerful way to see how the pieces of something fit together.
Yeah. UML is a unified modeling language, and it's a general-purpose developmental modeling language in the field of software engineering that's intended to provide a standard way to visualize the design of a system.
Fascinating.
I didn't know that at all. So now I feel like I've learned something from you guys. So thank you for that. Is that where the flow chart for Storm of King's Thunder and Tomb of Annihilation kind of, that page that kind of was like, oh, here's how it kind of maps to?
Yeah, because we had gotten feedback before working on Storm King's Thunder that some of our adventures were quite complex, and people like, help, basically.
Yeah, right. I can't visualize all this.
Give us some visual cues. So I thought with Storm King's Thunder, how about we do a flow chart early on so that people have a visual for how they might walk through what is admittedly a complex epic for people to adventure through.
Yeah, and I think that helped. I think got a lot of good feedback from that, from people just being like, "Oh, yeah, this makes," especially when it's so sandboxy, and there's so many different things you can do. At least you can have a representation of like, oh, if you're doing this thing, you should be at this level, blah blah blah. And even though we can throw all that out, and as we just talked about in that segment, but at least it's like a visualization that makes sense to most people. So I think it's super helpful, and what to prepare. If people are like, oh, they're going to do this, well, I'll read these 2 chapters so that I know kind of where they might end up going.
The another thing I'll say about preparation for sessions and for a whole campaign is I've mentioned before to people that I do almost all of my campaign prep in Microsoft OneNote. One reason I do that is I can access it on all my devices and computers. Also, I love it because you can write all of the notes in discrete boxes, which you can then drag around, which gives you a lot of flexibility for like when things happen in a different order than you expected, or
that's smart.
Or this encounter you designed to happen here, the players had their characters right around it. Well, then I just pluck up that whole little note and place it someplace else, and I'll reuse that content
to that
later.
Yeah, right, exactly. I wonder if I've never used any of those like Evernote or OneNote or things like that, but I've heard people using them for script writing for that reason too, where you can write a scene and then you can change where it goes, the order of things, very quickly and easier. So that makes sense.
Yeah, no, again, OneNote in particular is fantastic for this. It means I basically have all of my campaign notes accessible to me as long as
on your phone.
On my phone,
which is crazy.
Yeah, no, it means anywhere I am, if I suddenly have an idea for my campaign, I can just open up OneNote on my phone and quickly jot down my notes.
Well, I'm accessing OneNote right now with my Retina projector from the chip that is running it. So once we get there, that'll be even better.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We're going to take a quick break now, do some prepping for the interview. We're going to have 2 Skype callers coming in. Shelly and I will be speaking to Claire Hoffman and Travis Woodall from the D&D Adventurers League very soon. That's going to be very exciting. I can't wait. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back in a couple minutes. Those of you who haven't subscribed, you will be seeing some ads in this little break. If you don't want to watch those ads and instead you just rather watch the webcam footage of us moving around microphones and stuff in here, go ahead and subscribe. It's only $4.99, and you get access to tons of fun emotes. So how could you go wrong? All right. Thank you, guys. We'll see you in like 5-10 minutes. All right. Bye. And thank you, Jeremy.
My pleasure, as always.